All
All right.
right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to formally begin this presentation. My name is Jerry Talandis Jr. I teach at the University of Toyama, and I'll be your room host. This presentation is by Scott McLellan. We'll be talking about student-led research in the university classroom. Scott, it's all yours. Please go ahead.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. My name is Scott McLellan. I teach at a few different universities in the Tokyo area, some private, some public, and this is my second year of university instruction. So today I'm just going to go through my presentation, and it's on student-led research in the university classroom. So it's kind of my own approach to doing research papers. So let's get started with the PowerPoint here. So if there's any issues with the slides, please let me know. So basically, let's start with setting the context here. This approach is designed for second years at a public science university in Tokyo. And at this university, we are free to design a lot of our own materials and approaches, but we have to hit certain syllabus guidelines. So to that end, in first semester, the focus is on presentations. And in the second semester, the focus is on research papers. So when I started at this university, I was kind of quizzing the teachers to see what they do. And most approaches seem to be literature reviews and data set analysis. I really wanted to do something a bit different and a bit more motivating for students. So I wanted to introduce the idea of student-led research. So using original research. So how did I accomplish this and why? Well, let's focus on why first. So I apologize for the literature dump here, but basically let's work through this quickly. I wanted to kind of work on deeper level learning, active learning, learning by doing, really kind of raising student enthusiasm and really getting them involved. Lots of aspects of CBI and TBLT are involved here. Basically, this was a task I had to accomplish regardless, but I wanted to motivate students a little bit more, get them more involved in the process. And the research that I read led me to believe getting students involved in the research process and not just the writing process was a way I could accomplish this. So the students I'm teaching have been, they're all second years. In first year, they had to do academic written and academic spoken courses. So this is not their first introduction to academic English. They've had more formal instruction already, which makes things a bit easier for me. So keep that in mind if some of this material seems a bit advanced for some students. Many of them will go on to take technical English courses in third and fourth year, and even graduate level if they do go for graduate studies. So things like abstract writing and that kind of thing are in their future. So I kind of designed this course or this approach with that in mind for these students. So a quick overview of what they'll be doing. They'll be creating questionnaires on a chosen topic, gathering the responses, analyzing the data, writing research papers about their findings, and then presenting their papers. So those 5 steps are the basics of this approach. So for my classes, typically this is the approach I take. For the first 30 to 40 minutes, we do graded reading in class, some vocabulary review, some quick writing exercises. And then for the last hour, we focus on the project stuff. And that includes interactive activities that utilize some of the techniques and materials. And they're actively doing some of these things in the class. This was sidelined a bit this year as some of these things are more or less capable.
Excuse me, Scott.
Yes?
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
What materials do they do with the graded reading? I'm more curious about fiction versus non.
I allow them to select their own books for graded
Okay.
reading, and I teach them how to select them. They do mini presentations and reviews and that kind of stuff. And they come up to me and they share their level of their book. And I quiz them on how easy or hard it is and that kind of thing. So kind of
What's the
something I'm
percentage
looking
of
to
fiction
develop.
versus nonfiction that they choose?
Science students tend to prefer nonfiction. A lot of people want to read biographies of Bill Gates and that kind of thing. So, unfortunately, I find at least.
Thank you.
Oh, of course. So it starts with the questionnaires. So you have to get them used to it. And I like to do this by using class activities. Find someone who, real surveys in English that you get them to do, and creating questions from prompts. So this is how I introduce the subject of questionnaires. Here's an example of some of those materials. So they have a prompt, they need to create a question, and then they need to actually ask that question and gather that data. So it gets them used to the idea of question creation and question answering right from the beginning. Sometimes they even use real questionnaires and do some role playing practice with the material. So after they've had a taste of questionnaires, I go into more explicit explanation of surveys and questionnaires. So why survey research is important, why we're doing it, the merits and demerits, ideas about sample size and question type and creation. So that might be something like this, where we talk about the different types of questions that can appear on surveys and what kind of material or response we can elicit from those certain questions. The first major step of the project after they've selected whether they want to work individually or in a group, and they've chosen a topic, is for them to start drafting their questions for the questionnaires. And I sort of use this approach, which is adapted from two other educators, in which they are not writing just the question, but the purpose of the question and the type of question and how they're going to measure that effect. Like, is it a yes, no? Is it a multiple choice? So they're really thinking deeply about what they're trying to find, the information, and the question they're going to ask to get that information, and how they're going to measure the response. When it comes to questionnaires and practice, I also like to include things like this. What is a bad question? So this is a questionnaire full of terrible questions. And what they do is they analyze in groups about why these specific questions on this questionnaire are bad, why and how we can make them better. This is a really successful activity, and the students have a lot of fun with this one, looking at questions like, do you eat a lot of junk food? Yes or no? What's wrong with this question, right? Is it getting the right response or the right information? And things like this, going through examples of bad questions. Like this is an example of something that should be split into two questions and does not belong as a single question. So after they've drafted their questions, I like them to put them into Google Forms, because that just makes everything easier for gathering data, especially over COVID. You know, it's the right choice, I think. So I spent a little time talking about Google Forms. It's very intuitive, and I often make instructional videos if they want to review how to do it. But this is the kind of the final stage of question creation, is the piloting and testing phase. So a lot of this material is adapted not from ESL or EFL material, but whether from a native English language material created to teach people how to take and create questionnaires. This material is really accessible because it's not necessarily made for people with a post-secondary education. It's very accessible, made for a lot of English speakers with a basic education or basic understanding. So a lot of these approaches are immediately applicable for us with a little tweaking. When it comes to piloting in the classroom, it can be as simple as getting them to have other students take their questionnaires and looking for mistakes, be them grammatically or otherwise. Or they can do more advanced piloting techniques where they interview the student after the questionnaire to gauge their understanding, or ask the student to rephrase certain questions to see if they understood the question that was being asked. There's lots of different approaches, and these can be adjusted depending on the level of your students. The final step is I have to approve all questionnaires before they go out and start gathering their data. And that is a little bit labor intensive. So once their questionnaires are created and they're out there gathering data in the real world, and I allow them to use any means to gather data, whether it's a post on Twitter, Yahoo, I'm not going to list all the social medias, Facebook. It's up to them to get as many responses as possible. I usually try to set a minimum of double digits, but I've had some students last year who had over 100 responses. So that's pretty impressive. It really depends on their social network, no pun intended. So when it comes to the research paper, I like to take it in steps and to go slowly. So I actually start with the literature review first as the major component. I know this is not ideal for research, but well, we have to work with what we can. So when it comes to literature reviews, the main issue I have is that students tend to just dump all of their information in 90 says, 90 says, 90 says. There's no real division of the ideas. So what I want to do is move away from what we have on the left side and move towards what we have on the right side, more thematically organized ideas. And I like to use an approach from Cisco 2014 to teach this idea, where you kind of get them to think of the subject in infinite parts that they're defined parts that they're focusing on. And what they're going to do is they're going to put the information in the different buckets and really organize their literature review under subheadings. This makes it a bit easier for them as well. They can start organizing the themes in their mind about what their paper is about and what they're focusing on for their literature review. So I found this paper by Cisco quite useful, and it's worth having a look at. Also, just using visuals like this from Bryant, the idea that they're going out there and they're gathering the information, they're reviewing it, and then they're really putting it in select categories. I can talk about plagiarism in a sec, actually. It's one of my next slides. So when it comes to them actually reading the material, I use something like SQ3R, heavily modified to make it a bit easier for them, usually in a Google form, to make sure they've actually read the target material. This is simply just a way to know that they're not hunting with Control F for a paper for a certain phrase to support them, that they've actually read some of these papers in some depth, and they have to provide, an overview and summary. So I usually ask them to do one per person every 2 weeks. So hopefully by the end of their questionnaire, they've done about 5, and they've done, in my opinion, some decent amount of academic review. When it comes to plagiarism and citation, I do spend a lot of time on this. I kind of think of it from that Sun Tzu perspective of, if they fail once, then maybe it was your fault as the teacher. But if they fail twice, then maybe they're not paying active attention and they should be penalized a bit for plagiarism. So I make sure to review it early on from the beginning, and I teach citation at the same time. So I introduce the idea that not including citation is plagiarism. So I kind of teach them in tandem. And one thing that makes this a lot easier for me, and perhaps in the future, I'd like to do a presentation on that, is using Zotero or other citation keepers as a way to prevent plagiarism. If you can show them how dead simple it is to properly record data and citations, and then export them in IEEE or APA at a click of a button, it really makes plagiarism almost more difficult. So I think teaching this is incredibly useful. And if you haven't investigated yourself using Zotero with a Chrome plugin, I think it's great. I had an activity where they could either cite themselves in IEEE. I gave them a source and they had to provide the citation, or they could use Zotero to generate a citation. And I showed them that generating it with Zotero takes about a minute. Writing it yourself by hand could take 10 minutes. So kind of made the choice for them. They were introduced to the software that way. When it comes to the methods and results section for their data, this is kind of where they find it a little bit easier, because in first year, they had to do procedural writing in their writing classes. And as you know, when it comes to methods and results, procedural language is a direct lead-in. A lot of them are following the same procedures and using the same materials. So this can kind of be taught universally for all participants. And this section for them goes pretty quickly. There's not a lot of difficulties. When it comes to results, this is really where they shine as science students. They can do more statistically than I can, to be honest. Google Forms makes this easy too for students without a science background, because it can show them what they maybe want to focus on. Google Forms in the results section generates some overviews and pie charts and other forms that might show some significant data. So if your student doesn't know where to start, looking at the results generated in Google Forms might kind of point them towards some interesting areas. What I like to focus on when it comes to this is correlation analysis in Excel, because this is something that is easy to teach and to teach yourself too if you are not familiar with it. And it allows for some basic data analysis for those that are not new to the subject. And also it can be a fun lead into some lessons on correlation not equaling causation, which is always a great thing to review whenever you're talking about data analysis. And you can do this with some fun charts like this chart. What is this? This is the one on temperature and the amount of pirates in the world. So it kind of correlates the lack of pirates to causing global warming. So there's a few interesting charts like this you can go over with students to really hammer home the idea that correlation does not always equal causation. So if they're implying something is correlated, they can only kind of imply the causal results and not say them for certain, so to speak. For discussions and conclusions, I think it's no surprise that this is the most difficult part for students. The reason, in my opinion, a lot of students have issues with the discussion section is because it's so free form. They may ask you, well, what am I supposed to write? I don't know what to do. Give me some scaffolding. And they're not too comforted when you tell them that, well, this is really up to you how you want to approach this section. There's a few major notes you can hit on. Like, for example, basically trying to explain what your results mean and how this relates to existing research. But if you give them a few checklists to work through, I think that really helps guide them in this section, as well as for some students, they really shine with the added freedom as well, because there's something they've seen that they really want to talk about. And they haven't seen anywhere to talk about it because the research paper follows such a semi-rigid structure. But you can tell them discussions and conclusion is where you can really shine with your own opinion and analysis. For conclusion, I tend to make it simple for them and tell them they just need to do a brief overview or summary and really give the reader something to remember, impart them something to remember. Um, so maybe I've been moving through a bit fast here. How am I for time?
You have 7 minutes left.
Okay.
Yep.
So I've been talking a bit faster than I apologize. There's 3 other major elements that are important to mention when I do this. It's student peer review, student and teacher one-on-one editing, and the presentation element of the project. So I do have one class dedicated to students reviewing each other's papers. And I've kind of thought about adjusting this. There's a lot of research about the benefits of peer review when it comes to writing, but this tends to have a ESL focus, a lot of this material, and it doesn't seem to be directly applicable always to EFL work. I notice when I've tried it in multiple different classrooms with different skill levels, um, peer review tends to be less successful than literature would lead you to believe because students don't have the skill set or the confidence necessarily to review their classmates' papers. And there's a few ways around this. I've tried the oral peer review method where you have a group of 3 or 4 students and one student reads their paper out loud and the other students have copies and they're highlighting mistakes and notes as they go. And that had mixed results as well. So I'm still always looking for a more effective way to approach that day of peer editing. One of the more successful things I've been doing, it's a little labor intensive, but it's student and teacher one-on-one editing. So I devote sometimes 2 entire classes to working one-on-one with the students on their second draft. And I bring in a draft of the paper that's marked up, as you will, with content errors and not every grammar error, but many grammar errors that repeat. And I go over it with them for 5 or 6 minutes and make sure they understand what they need to do to improve for their final draft. This is what I've gotten the best feedback with students from, and it's really difficult in classes with 30 to 35 students. It is really difficult. You have to be efficient and you have to come in with notes and be prepared to meet with each individual group of student. But it really seems to have the greatest effect on them and their writing skills, and they seem to really appreciate that one-on-one work. I really don't know a way of replacing that. It's labor intensive, but I really don't know a way of replacing that one-on-one work because it really seems to have a great effect on their writing and their self-confidence. Um, but what I do to counteract that amount of work is for their final drafts, I don't give them a heavily marked up version of their final draft. What I give them is a comment and a general score. So I'm putting the majority of work on their second drafts, knowing that they're going to have to see those and make those corrections. What happens to final drafts that are marked up? They often end up in the recycling bin or the trash, if that. So that way, working with physical copies of the paper one-on-one with the students in their second drafts, I find is really impactful. When it comes to highlighting plagiarism, those students do not plagiarize again once you go through with them how you found those errors, how easy it was, and that their scores is 0 now unless they make these changes. So it can be quite impactful. The final element, which I didn't have a lot of time to focus on in this presentation, is presentations. In the first semester, they did an entire unit on presentations, and they're taking those skill sets and they're using them to present their papers at the end of the semester. They have time to practice when I'm working one-on-one with the editing. That's when they're off on their groups practicing. So it's kind of hard to give an overview of an entire semester in 20 minutes. So I kind of created a bit of a guide that I can go over later about how I divide up the work. But when it comes to limitations, I think it's important to mention that time is the biggest limitation here. I have 3 classes and maybe about 28 to 30 students in each class, and this is time intensive. It requires motivated, semi-independent students. They have to have a basic level of academic skills. And there's always a bit of a fear that with this sort of work, students will be left behind. Like they didn't get their questionnaires right. They're not gathering data. It's time to move on to the next section. What have they done? But I try to counteract this by giving discrete marks for each section and not having one giant final mark hanging over their head. They have to do the different steps and they get marked individually on the different steps and they get one final mark for the completed material. So that's where we are right now. Here's a bit of an overview of what a semester might look like as far as introducing and going through the different steps of the research paper. And you can see at the end, the last month is kind of dedicated to peer editing and one-on-one editing. So sorry, let me open up the chat here. I know there were some questions.
Yeah, you've got about 2 minutes. So
okay.
The questions, please go at it. Go
yeah,
ahead.
Perhaps if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask the question directly now, that would be great.
Scott?
Hello.
Kai, could we get a copy of your slideshow?
Sure, yeah, I can make it available, absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, this is so useful. Thank you so much.
Sure, not a problem.
Can I ask a simple question?
Sure, I should stop sharing actually, sorry.
Hi, I'm Tetsuya.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm doing something very similar in my writing course. In my writing course, my students have to collect the data through their questionnaire and they write a research paper. But you talked about correlations, but is this the only way they can analyze their data or they can do something else?
They're welcome to do whatever they like. I should have taken more statistics courses in college. Maybe I could teach a little more. But I usually encourage them to do some Likert scale questions, or I think we call them linear scale questions now, because that makes that sort of analysis a bit easier. But I teach them one way of analysis, and many of them have a more of a background in data analysis. And I encourage them to go out and do what they want. But I don't set that as a goal they have to hit if they're not familiar with that. It's a bit beyond a second-year English course for some of them.
Right. My students are also second-year students, and they are taking English courses as one of the compulsory subjects.
Okay.
But in my class, they have to do one of the statistical analysis, like correlation, t-test, ANOVA, one of those things. And some of my students are very familiar with that kind of statistical analysis. And if you are teaching at a kind of science university, then they may enjoy doing that kind of thing.
I think that might be a great challenge to look into. I will familiarize myself a little more with those techniques, and maybe I can look into implementing them. My fear initially was that if they run into issues, I'm not going to be able to provide enough guidance. So I
I
can
mean,
learn myself.
we don't have to be familiar with those stats. Students can.
Right.
All right, everyone. Sorry I had to interrupt here, but that's all the time that we have. It sounds like you guys want to keep talking about this, so I highly recommend go ahead now over to the Hangouts room.
Okay.
This is room number 5, so when you get to the Hangouts room, just ask for room number 5. It's usually how they do it, and you can go over there and continue discussing. I saw there are a few more questions in the chat that we didn't have time to get to. So please go ahead and keep it going if you have some time. All right. So I just want to say again, thank you very, very much, Scott. It was an excellent presentation, very useful, very informative, well presented and clear. And as an academic writing teacher myself, I'm really looking forward to watching this video again and really reflecting more deeply on your work. It's been very, very ambitious and interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you. For
Everyone,
that.
could we unmute yourself and say thank you? All right, thank you. All right, got it. All right, take care, everyone. Thank you very much, and good luck, and have a good rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I didn't get to your question, I'll just pop into the Hangouts and we can follow up.
Sounds
Thank you.
great. Take care, everyone. Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you.